One thing I wanted to kind of maybe draw attention to is when you look at reviews of Carys's work, especially the stories, you'll hear the word folk tale come up a lot. And I kind of thought it would be interesting to just very briefly kind of explore what that might mean. For example, for me, folk tales are kind of, they're kind of like those desire lines that kind of run through meadows and on the side of roads where you kind of like a path beaten by people's feet. It's not an official path. And they're that kind of, I think of them as that because they're kind of unofficial. Folk tales and desire lines are unofficial paths, but they're well known and they're well worn, and they're always on the fringes of places. They're always on the fringes of our consciousness. Like folk tales they contain and reveal at certain points our hidden fears of a particular town or a society or things like that. And Carys's work does that like so well, and it does it in a very specific way in terms of, sure, it can be related to folktales or compared to folktales, but they're also like these vivid personal stories about vivid moments in a person's life, and they all add up. That when you have a collection of them, they all add up to some kind of almost Canterbury Tale-esque picture of maybe not a particular society because they're set in many different places at many different times. But just a picture of a kind of a common consciousness and its hidden fears, like things like stolen children or found children, stories about, like almost like not urban myths, but like the guy who was jilted at the altar and stuff like that. And so like they're just so perfectly done, and I'll probably ask you how the hell you did it in a little bit. But that's the stories, and again, thinking about folktales, the other thing that's kind of cool is they're really good surprises in them. Like I wrote down the Guardian's quote, and that was in Carys Davies' stories, "The world can shift in a sentence." And that's really true of a lot of the stories. The taking of Bonnet, which is in The Redemption of Galen Pike, is, for me, contains like the biggest like WTF moment of any story I've read. It's absolutely fantastic. And then there's West, the novel which came out a few months ago. The premise of this is it's 1815 in America. A man named Cy Bellman is sitting at the kitchen table, I think, reading a newspaper article, and he reads about these giant bones that have been found somewhere west of where he lives. And he has to go. He has to go and find out what they are, or do giants exist? And he follows this course, and in the process leaves behind a 10-year-old daughter. And it's kind of correctly billed as an epic in miniature. It's an utterly compelling book. We're going to hear a little bit of that as well. I think it's about belief. It's about the need to search for something, the need for wonder. It's also about responsibility, personal responsibility, moral responsibility. And there's a really interesting thing, that idea of searching, that we don't get to search for things anymore unless it's like our keys when we're leaving the house, right? But there was a time when people could go out and maps were full of blank spaces. And there's something really, really, that drew me straight into it, like this idea of a search. So we might talk about that as well. The Irish Times say it's beautifully written with wisdom and lyrical prose. It's morally complex. They compare it to Steinbeck. Sarah Martin compared it to Steinbeck. Again, not unfair. The Guardian call it a book that balances each individual consciousness against the dizzying weight of all the mystery of the earth and everything in it and beyond it. It's both timeless and historically specific. I would add that it's also very emotionally specific. So I think you're going to give us a short story first, and then we'll have a bit of West. So give it a massive round.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here at the festival, and I'm going to read a short story. Well, I won't say too much about it actually to begin with. I think Danny and I will talk about it a little bit afterwards, so I'll just read the story. Am I close enough here?
Yeah.
Bonnet. It's early when she boards the London train, dark when she leaves the house, and still dark when she arrives at the station in Leeds and enters her compartment and nods to her fellow passengers. What do they see, her fellow passengers? They see a small, plain, obscure woman in a black travelling outfit. On her head, a large funnel-shaped bonnet, also black, with a dark grey lining. A small, plain, obscure-looking woman who has been to London several times before and has no plan when she gets to her lodgings to do anything differently from the last time, or the time before that, or the time before that. It's only the next morning when she is walking along Gracechurch Street that she decides to do it. And even then it doesn't feel like a decision, it feels like she is being carried along on a wave of something she cannot help. For a long time she stands there before going in. She knows that in a great many ways she has led a sheltered life, and that there are plenty of things she doesn't know, such as the right places to go for certain things. Even now, when she comes to London, she feels most of the time like a clumsy traveller in a foreign land. She can see herself in the glass, her black travelling outfit, her dark, big bonnet with its grey lining, her reflection very clear in the sparkling window. How clean the window is. She herself has been doing a lot of cleaning lately. When she can't write, and these days she cannot seem to write a single line, cleaning feels like a good, productive thing to do. Still not quite knowing what she'll do when she gets inside, she pushes open the door. He wants to talk to her, he said in his letter, about her next book. The appointment is at 4 o'clock, which means she has 2 hours. As soon as she's inside, the bell on the door ringing out its last chimes behind her, she knows why she's come. The choice is bewildering. That one, she says, pointing, after much deliberation over the possibilities, and takes the money from her purse. A huge amount, it seems, for such a thing. And then she takes off her bonnet and puts it on the counter and watches it being taken away through the curtain and sits and waits till it's ready. She feels naked without her bonnet, almost asks if there is one she can borrow while she's waiting. At 3:45, she leaves the shop, her bonnet back on her head, and makes her way along Gracechurch Street and from there to Cornhill to attend the meeting that is due to take place at 4 with her young publisher. He has written her a letter, her tall, dark-haired, handsome young publisher, but she has not received it. Not the letter asking if they can talk about her next book. Another letter, a second letter. It was early when she left home yesterday and climbed into her compartment, first at Keighley, then at Leeds, and she has not received this second letter, as he expected she would have before her visit. A second letter, in which he's told her the news that he has fallen in love with a Miss Elizabeth Blakeway and is engaged to be married. He is standing behind his desk when she is shown into his office, a collection of papers in his hand. His pale complexion is flushed from his morning ride in the park, and in the half second it takes for him to look up from his reading, she takes him in afresh. His rangy, athletic height, his youthful, generous, intelligent, shrewd, and sensitive face. Never in her whole life has she been as conscious of her own appearance as she is at this moment. And she is always, always acutely and painfully conscious of her own appearance when she is with him here in London. Here in his office, or having dinner with his mother and his sisters, or out in public, at the opera, or at an exhibition, or at some terrifying literary party. But she has never, ever been as conscious as she is now of her own tiny body and large, ill-proportioned head, her crooked mouth and her thin hair, bulked up with its little pad of stuffed brown silk, of her big nose, of her spectacles, of her age, or of how until this moment she has never appeared before him in anything other than black or grey. It is pink, the new lining of her bonnet, a lustrous, pearly pink like the interior of a shell, and it is the worst imaginable thing when he looks up, for him to see it, for him to see this small, plain woman, his friend, with this unexpected bonnet on her head. For a moment, he is speechless. All he can do is stand there looking at her and wishing that he could tell her something, the future perhaps, that before she dies in 18 months' time, at the age of 38, she will marry and be so happy eventually in this brief, late marriage with her quiet clergyman husband that she will not care if she never writes another word. But he knows nothing of her future, nothing that could come now to her rescue or to his, and all he can do is to move towards her and shake her hand with what he hopes is all his usual warmth, and invite her to sit. And for an hour, they talk about her books and the books of other people. They've always got along so well together. Their discussions have always been so lively and full of interest. And he says nothing about the bonnet, and neither does she, but it is the worst imaginable thing for her to sit and feel the bright new silk around her face like a shout, and see how embarrassed he is, how he can't look at it. It's late when she boards the night train, dark when she leaves her lodgings and arrives at Euston Square and enters a compartment and nods to her fellow passengers. By 6 the next morning, she is a world away in Leeds, and by 8 in Keighley again, where, unable to face the prospect of being collected in the Haworth gig, she begins at once the long walk home, keeping her eyes down to avoid her reflection in shop fronts and the windows of houses. It has been raining, though, here in the north. There are puddles everywhere, and she is in all of them. A small, plain, obscure-looking woman in a black travelling outfit. On her head, a large funnel-shaped bonnet, also black, with a dark grey lining.
These on automatically? Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much, Carys.
My pleasure.
So that's a kind of, when I talk about vivid personal moments, we get to meet an almost cripplingly self-conscious person.
Mm-hmm.
It's Charlotte Bronte.
It is indeed. I don't know if everybody. I'm never quite sure when I read the story. There is, in the book, I never like doing notes to stories, but in this case, I did make an exception. There is a note at the back of the book which describes a little of the background to this story. This story came to me unusually quickly. Most of my stories take a very, very, very long time. The Tiger story took about 10 years, to sort of gradually reveal itself to me. But this story came very quickly, and it came with this image of a woman getting onto a train, and I didn't actually know it was Charlotte Bronte at first, but I had been reading over the previous few years lots and lots about the Brontes, and became slightly obsessed with Charlotte, I think. She had such a tragic life. I mean, almost overwhelmingly tragic. She saw all her siblings die, and then there was this whole question about whether she was in love with her publisher, George Smith, who was about a decade younger than she was. And reading her letters, reading between the lines, I certainly think she was. And if I can, what happened was that he falls in love with another woman, and he and Charlotte are great friends. He falls in love with another woman, and he doesn't write to tell her, and Charlotte only finds out eventually when his mother writes. And Charlotte then writes to George, and this is her letter of congratulation. My dear sir, in great happiness as in great grief, words of sympathy should be few. Accept my meed of congratulation, and believe me, sincerely yours, C. Bronte. You know, the whole, we have that famous portrait of Charlotte, but from all the written descriptions that we have of Charlotte, I think the painting's probably very inaccurate. Everybody writes about what a strange-looking woman she was, and you know, living as she did in the north. Her clothes were strange, and she was very tiny, and she did have this. Well, I suppose it was like a hairpiece, really. This little pad of brown silk to sort of make her hair more voluminous. And at one point, George Smith actually persuaded her to go and have her portrait painted. And when she went, the painter sort of said, "What's this you've got sort of here?" And she burst into tears. You know, she was so self-conscious. So in this story, I wanted to capture that pain, but also capture some sense of that brief happiness that she does find subsequently with Arthur Nichols, who she marries.
That was a lovely little kind of zoom out moment, actually, where you realise that there's another. It's not this kind of very close third person. There's a greater consciousness that can see that she will be happy and stuff. Is that something you worked hard to?
I have to say that yes, there's that sort of sleight of hand with time, where you know it's one of the joys of writing is that you can do anything if you can pull it off. And you know, technically, when you look at it, you're sort of thinking who's speaking there. It's not George Smith. He doesn't know, and Charlotte certainly doesn't know. But it's a sort of it's another view on
it's something I kind of wanted to ask you about, because I noticed it comes in the first collection, Some New Ambush. There's this story called Piper, and it's about well, I don't want to give it too much away, but it's about a woman who finds a baby in the sand at the beach, and she kind of tries to pass the child off as her own, and it goes through. But the voice that it's written is kind of like, it's an I voice, but it's kind of our town, it's more of a we voice than an I voice. And is that, like, where do you think that comes from in your work, or is it?
Well, with that story in particular, I know exactly where the voice came from. I think often with a story, when you're writing it, it's the moment where you discover who's telling the story and why there's some urgent need for the story to be told. So in this particular story, it does begin with a woman finding a baby on a beach, and she takes the baby home. And it felt as if I was writing a third-person story. And then when she brings it home, and again, without wanting to give too much away about the story, I realised that this was an I, and this was somebody who lived in the town, who had something of a stake in the whole, in this child.
Yeah, and maybe if we say another word, we might kill the kind of lovely, I don't want to call them twists, because that sounds stupid, but the lovely turn in the story. And maybe going back to Bronte, was it difficult? It sounds like you knew a lot about her and had read a lot of work, whether it was specific research for a story or just your general interest. Was it difficult then to say, I'm only going to pick this one moment?
No, because I don't ever specifically research the stories. Even with the novel West, I did spend a year in the library in New York, in the archive, reading masses about the period and so on, but really just to understand, not looking for things, how can I now cast this into fiction? So you know, I think everything that you read, everything you know, you have it in the back, but you almost have to throw it away. So no, I didn't feel. She was just there in this moment, in this brief moment, and she felt very real to me.
And she feels very real, I think, to me as well. that just heard it, like again, that's kind of going back to what I was talking about, that there's this incredible self-conscious, that bit at the end, she's kind of looking in puddles and only seeing her face in the dark grey bonnet and stuff. It's brilliantly done. Historical figures, she's not the only one. We get Dickens and Wilkie Collins in a story. We get the Queen. I'm not sure actually which Queen it is anymore. I can't remember.
It's Queen Victoria.
We get the Queen in another story. Are you drawn to historical figures, or is it kind of happenstance?
Those two stories. I've lived for 18 years in Lancaster, in the northwest of England, and the story I wrote about, which features Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins visiting the county lunatic asylum, as it was called then, that came from a plaque on one of the hotels in town which commemorates their visit. And Queen Victoria, the Queen, the British Queen is always the Duke of Lancaster, so there are masses of statues all over town of Queen Victoria. So that story imagines a story where Queen Victoria visits Lancaster, and she has an encounter with a heartbroken local alderman who tells her story. So,
and it's so lovely that she kind of says, no one ever tells me their stories.
Well, these statues are all over town, and we all know what Queen Victoria, it's that kind of pouchy, very, very miserable-looking face. So that I think was, she just looks so lonely, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. And given that the story is something like that's 3 stories out of over 30, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not all historical figures, but some of them take place way back in time. Some of them take place in the current day. I started kind of adding up the settings, and there's a few in America. There's one in Siberia. I'm very interested to ask how a story comes about for you, because you don't seem to be tied to a particular place, even while I think you are kind of cataloguing a kind of a human common consciousness. You're not really tied to a particular, like a small town in Wales or Lancaster or Lancashire. You're not tied to America. How does a story generally come about for you, or is there a trend at all?
I wish there were, and I wish I knew how I went about finding them, and then I'd go to that place all the time. So it's generally a very chaotic and unpredictable process. It can start with a name. It can start with an image. I'm very drawn to places I've never been to. I think there's something very freeing about writing stories, and Siberia, I've never been to Siberia. Something very freeing about setting stories where you strip away all the sort of clutter of life, and everything is boiled down to something very essential. And a lot of my stories deal with the difficulty that we have in knowing each other. We're all taught at school that no man is an island, but we're all islands, and that's one of the mysteries of life, that we struggle to know each other. So in some sense, I'm very drawn to situations where characters they have to sort of fall back on each other. They don't have very much choice, and I'm interested in those moments of distance, and then the moments where people might come together, even if it's very briefly, before they spring apart again. Like in the Queen Victoria story.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of The Quiet as well, where these two characters who you think are going to be in conflict for the whole thing, and they share a story, and it just completely...
Yes, and that's a story set in the Australian outback, where also I've never been.
Yeah. Brilliant. And so, I suppose one other thing I want to ask you about stories, maybe before we start talking about West, I felt that, again, going down that folktale, some of these stories have morals, like the Siberia story kind of becomes, a moral is maybe too strong of a word, but it has a lesson, right? A lot of the stories have this kind of lesson. I'm wondering, do you ever start out with a lesson that you want, or does that kind of just work its way in?
Absolutely, definitely not. No, I mean, the Siberia story, I should maybe tell you a little bit about. This is a story about a woman who, from Birmingham, who leaves her husband. We don't know why at the beginning. She sets off to Siberia.
And she says, after the last one.
After the last time. And this is, and I always say, I'm not in any way an autobiographical writer, but this particular story, I don't know if I know I'm giving something away here, but it's basically a story about people arguing in cars. So it's very much a story that grew out of the arguments that my husband and I have when we're driving and trying to get anywhere. And it seems to be a story that strikes home to so many people.
Yeah.
So that story, it in a way, it was a kind of was almost like a sort of admonition to myself to just keep calm and don't end up in Siberia. And then the other story, there's a story in this collection called Precious, which is a story about religious extremism. But I absolutely didn't set out to write about that. It's a story about a tourist who wanders into a town and is mistaken for a god, and they sort of they take him prisoner, and the story just headed off in this direction and became really a very serious story about religious fundamentalism and extremism, but I absolutely didn't plan to write a story.
So yeah, okay, so it's kind of in there, seeping out. I guess that's what happens when people get together and things happen, and we learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true. There is certainly I think it's fair to say I take a moral position in West, in my novel, which is a story about, it's partly a story about the search for knowledge, but it's also a story about the extinction of a people and settlement. And there's certainly a moral position there, which I think probably comes through quite strongly.
Yes, absolutely.
Even if one of the main white character is fairly oblivious to everything that's going on.
Yeah, I might go back 2 steps before we get into whether the moral complexity of that. How did West come about first and foremost? Because it is a novel set in the American West in the 1800s.
It came about when I'd been living in the United States for most of the 90s, and towards the end of that time, my husband bought the Journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition in a bookshop on Shelter Island, and we moved back to the UK, and these journals duly sat on a high shelf in my study, gathering dust, until one day about 4 years ago, I suppose, I got them down and read them, and then went back to the beginning, and there's an introduction which mentioned the discovery of enormous bones in a Kentucky swamp through the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And nobody knew really what these bones were certainly in terms of the settlers, they didn't know what they were. And then there was this one detail that was completely electrifying to me, which was that a lot of people at the time thought that maybe these creatures, these mammoth creatures, might still exist beyond the frontier, out in the unexplored territories of the West. So that was really, usually I find it very hard to say where a story comes from, but in this case it's very easy. It was, that was just a detail that drops you straight into the head of somebody from another time. And as you were saying earlier, a time when the world was still a blank canvas in many respects.
And did you go straight to, was it Cy Bellman sitting at the table reading?
No, not at all. So for a couple of years I was writing sketches which included the real Lewis and Clark, President Thomas Jefferson, But all the time I just had the sense that there was a sort of richer, darker, more interesting story underneath the surface if I could just find a way of telling it. And I know it always sounds a bit glib when a writer says this, but one day Cy just walked onto the page, actually wearing his hat. He has this big stovepipe hat. So it's just a very visual image that came in, and I followed him.
Fantastic. Now, Cy is a mule. Do you say mule farmer or do you?
Mule breeder.
Mule breeder. He's a mule breeder. He has a 10-year-old daughter. Mm-hmm. His wife died. It was kind of surprising actually. His wife died 8 years before, say, he reads the article. But you kind of still feel like, well, I kind of still felt like, and maybe I'll ask you, is he in the moment of grief still? Because he does do a very drastic thing, which is say, I'm going to go, I've got to go. He says to his 10-year-old daughter, I've got to go see if these giants exist. And he leaves her with the aunt. Is it his sister or is it
It's his sister.
It's his sister.
Yes.
He leaves Bess with his sister, and off he goes for 2 years.
He is, yes. I mean, he's very adrift. He's lost his religious faith, and he's lost his wife. So I think because he reads about these bones and the rumours about the creatures, and I think it's just a kind of perfect storm in him of a sense of a sort of emptiness, but at the same time a ferocious curiosity and need to know.
It might be a good time to
Okay.
a slice. Yeah.
So shall I just do that first little reading, or
as we discussed?
Okay.
As you like.
Okay. All right.
Go for it.
So as Danny said, so we're in Pennsylvania in around about the year 1816 with our hero, our flawed hero, Cy Bellman, and I'm just going to read the passage where he first hears about these enormous creatures. The whole thing had lit a spark in him. For half a day he'd sat without moving. He'd read it a dozen times. When Bess came in from the yard wanting to chatter and play, he told her to run along. He was busy. When darkness fell, he lit the lamp and read it again. He fetched a knife and scored it around and folded it into quarters and placed it in the pocket of his shirt next to his heart. He felt his breath come differently. He could no longer sit still. He paced about, and every half hour he took the folded paper from his shirt pocket and smoothed it flat on the top of the table and read it again. There were no illustrations, but in his mind they resembled a ruined church or a shipwreck of stone, the monstrous bones, the prodigious tusks, uncovered where they lay, sunk in the salty Kentucky mud, teeth the size of pumpkins, shoulder blades a yard wide, jawbones that suggested a head as tall as a large man. A creature entirely unknown, an animal incognitum. People poking and peering at the giant remains and wondering what had happened to the vast beasts the bones had belonged to, if perhaps the same gigantic monsters still walked the earth in the unexplored territories of the West. Just thinking about it had given him a kind of vertigo. For months he thought about nothing else. When Bess came asking if he wanted to play checkers or go for a walk outside to pet the new hinny with a white patch on its face, he said no. For several weeks he spent most of his days in bed. When he did drag himself to his feet, he worked mechanically in the yard and pasture with the animals. And when the new mules and hinnies were born, he went to town and sold them. When a winter storm took off half the roof, he repaired it. He cooked, and occasionally he cleaned, and made sure Bess had a pair of shoes on her feet. But he was silent the whole time, and sometimes his eyes turned glassy, and he would not let Bess come near him. The giant beast drifted across his mind, like the vast creature-shaped clouds he saw when he stood in the yard behind the house and tipped his head up to the sky. When he closed his eyes, they moved behind the lids in the darkness, slowly, silently, as if through water. They walked and they drifted, pictures continually blooming in his imagination and then vanishing into the blackness beyond it, where he could not grasp them. The only thing left in his head, the thought of them being alive and perambulating out there in the unknown, out there in the West, beyond the United States, in some kind of wilderness of rivers and trees and plains and mountains, and there to behold with your own two eyes, if you could just get yourself out there and find them. There were no words for the prickling feeling he had, that the giant animals were important somehow, only the tingling that was almost like nausea, and the knowledge that it was impossible for him now to stay where he was. Before the summer was over, he was standing in his sister's house. All I can say, Julie, is that they feel very real to me. All I can say is that the only thing in the world I want to do now is go out there into the West and find them. So for a long time with this, I was writing about Si and setting off with him on his journey. The thing about this moment in history is that being there in the United States in around 1816 is that there's another kind of extinction going on, which is the driving of the Native Americans out of their ancestral lands in the East. So I knew pretty early on that this was going to be there was a sort of double extinction going on, another threatened extinction, as European settlers like Si himself arrive and push them further and further west. So I knew that had to be part of the story too. And as Si moves west, he meets a fur trader who furnishes him, let's say, with a guide, a young Shawnee boy who goes by the name of Old Woman from a Distance. And Si, as I was hinting at before, is rather oblivious of what's been, historically. He's a man of his moment, but he doesn't feel any particular responsibility for what's happening. So I'm just going to read you a little bit now where Si and Old Woman from a Distance are travelling west, and it's the evening and they're settling down to sleep. The big white man always fell asleep before he did. Wrapped in his thick woolen coat, he was always snoring within a short time. His breathing slowed and deepened, and after that his body twitched from time to time like a sleeping dog's, and the boy wondered what dreams he had. He'd seen a red-haired white man once before, the day the settlers had come and set fire to his people's crops and tents. Smaller and thinner, but with the same flame-coloured beard and head hair, pulling his sister into the open, his sister kicking and scratching and crying out, the skinny white settler with his red hair and his red beard moving on her like a dog and then cutting her throat. In his dreams, he still saw her kicking and scratching and heard her crying out. When he woke and saw the big white man near him, half his face covered in red hair like the other one, there were times when he almost gagged. A beard of any colour was a gross thing, an animal thing, that carried in its bristles the stink of food, sometimes crumbs and threads of actual food. But this one was worse because it was red like the other man's. Sometimes, as he and the big explorer were going along, when they were lifting the pirogue or strapping the bags onto the horses, the big red beard brushed against his cheek and he retched. The smell, the picture in his head, the skinny white man from before. Some nights, Bellman woke in the dark, and when he opened his eyes, the boy was looking at him. Over on the other side of their softly glowing fire, points of light popping in and out, the ash shifting as the sticks burned through and broke and quietly fell. When Bellman looked, the boy was not asleep, but lying there with his small pip-like eyes, white and wide open in the dark. It made Bellman feel safe. The boy awake like that and alert, watching for danger that Bellman might not even know was there. So, as the story goes on, we never quite know which way Old Woman from a Distance is going to roll. Do we have time for
I'd love to hear
a short Bess reading?
Yeah.
So the novel alternates between Si's story as he makes his way west, and Bess, his young daughter, who he's left at home in the east in the reluctant care of his sister Julie. And I'm just going to read a short scene where their neighbour, they have a neighbour called Elmer Jackson, and who helps with the farm, and he's come over to visit. From her bed, Bess heard her Aunt Julie and Elmer Jackson talking. They were drinking coffee. Every now and then she could hear the soft clunk of their cups on the table. Of course I think about him, her Aunt Julie was saying. I think about him reading in the newspaper about the possible existence of a large, big-toothed monster, and saying to himself, oh, I know what to do, pack my bags and buy myself a big new hat, and point myself immediately in its direction and ride 2,000 miles towards it, so I can be sure of stepping right into its jaws. Her aunt had made her voice deep and stupid sounding, and Bess heard Elmer Jackson let go of a hearty laugh. When she peeked out from behind the curtain in front of her bed, she saw him slap his thigh. She also saw that his appreciation of her Aunt Julie's imitation of her father had caused her aunt to blush. Bess had never seen her Aunt Julie blush before. She watched her aunt pat the coil of greyish-brown hair at the back of her neck, the back of her head above the collar of her dress, and tuck a stray wisp of it behind her ear. She'd never heard her aunt so cosy with Elmer Jackson, the two of them sitting there in the lamplight, drinking their coffee, and she wondered if maybe her Aunt Julie wasn't getting a little bit sweet on their neighbour and he on her. She would never have expected it. It was the last thing she would have predicted, her aunt's growing warmth towards Elmer Jackson, a surprising thing she couldn't fathom or explain. She wondered if this was how it would be from now on. Elmer Jackson here in the house almost every evening, her Aunt Julie sitting with him and talking to him and laughing with him about her father and blushing when Elmer Jackson laughed too. Bess retreated again behind her curtain and lay down. After a little while she heard the scratch of Elmer Jackson's chair across the wooden floor and the closing of the door, and then there were the sounds of her Aunt Julie rinsing the coffee cups in the pail and taking off her boots, the creak of her father's bed upstairs as her aunt climbed into it. In the darkness and the quiet, Bess could hear the ticking of the wall clock. When she closed her eyes, she still saw a picture of what the clock looked like after her father had ridden away. When she turned at last to go back into the house, it had its arms flung out across its big round face, one pointing one way and one in the opposite direction, as if one hand was pointing west and the other east. In daylight, there was a different time she liked more than any other, and she did everything she could to be in the house when it arrived. The time when the bigger of the two hands crept slowly through the 12 until it joined the smaller one, both of them pointing east. So that's a little bit of Bess's story, and I don't think it's giving too much away to say that while Si is off looking for monsters in the west, it might just be that there are monsters in the east as well.
I was kind of thrown right. This is a book that's compelling from page one. There's no hanging about. You're straight into it, and I was just right back in it there again for 10 minutes.
I was thinking actually, sorry, I was thinking about your earlier question about folk tales, and even though this is a Western, I think for me there is quite a strong folk tale element about it too, and I think in my head there's a sort of element of Beauty and the Beast, the father going off, saying that he'll, promising to come back with gifts and so on. I think there's also a little, I think as I was writing it, I was, if anything, thinking of the Odyssey, where Odysseus goes off, and what we always forget, I think, is that his son Telemachus is a very big part of the story, waiting for his father to come back. And to mention the Brontes again, I think there's probably also, that image in Wuthering Heights at the beginning where Catherine's father first comes home and, instead of bringing some other kind of gifts, he's brought a small, dark, mysterious boy back. So I think those sorts of influences were swirling around in my head as I was writing this book.
It's 100% true that it is a folk tale. I think it's about a man who goes away in search of giants. One thing that I don't want to put you on the spot, because actually it's up to the reader to decide who they root for and who they think is in the right and in the wrong. But just to think about Cy Bellman for a minute as a man who feels a sense of wonder for something out there in the world, for a mystery, for magic. And he goes after it. And in that sense, I relate to him. It's like, wow, I would love to feel something like that. And he's an adventurer, an explorer. Another view of Cy Bellman is that he is a man who abandons his 10-year-old daughter, who waits at home, I don't want to say she's naive, because actually she's a very realistic character, but she's never going to give up hope for him, and she thinks he's done the right thing. She believes 100% in him. She doesn't like hearing people badmouth him. But he has left her, and he's abandoned a personal responsibility. And then another view of Cy Bellman is that he's completely ignorant of the genocide, the extinction of the Native Americans before him. And there's that wonderful scene. He wakes up in the middle of the night and takes comfort in seeing this boy, this Native American boy with the Native American boys looking at him going, like, someone just like you, murdered my sister. At what point, so I won't ask you to tell me what you think about whether do you root for Cy or not, but I'm wondering at what point in the writing of it did you realise how important he was as a symbol in various ways, and how did you harness that, or were you aware of it at all?
I root for all my characters, and the main characters in this book, Cy and Old Woman from a Distance and Bess, I root for them all in different ways. Cy, he is very flawed, and he goes because he can. Some readers sort of said, couldn't she sort of have a bit more agency? And one thing I feel very strongly about historical literature is that I think there is a bit of a tendency sometimes, I don't know if it's particularly true of women writers, but to empower female characters in a way that's inauthentic. So I wanted, Bess she's 10 at the beginning of the story, she's 12 by the end. To me, she's an incredibly feisty, plucky character, but she's also, she's 10 in early 19th century Pennsylvania. She has very, very few options. She has no agency, unlike Cy, who is free to get up on his horse and
wander as he pleases. She does, there is a moment in it where she says something along the lines of, I am too young to not have a protector. Why? Yes. So she kind of has a sense of agency that she knows what's happening is wrong, but she doesn't, her love, maybe for her father, is so strong that she doesn't blame him in any way. Is it a very, this is just occurring to me on the spot, I'm kind of becoming increasingly aware of my masculinity and the kind of backdrop of lots of toxic masculinity. Is it a very male thing to do? This guy's going, I'm just going to go off and find the giants.
Well, historically it has been, because, it's that thing of, you know, because they can. I mean, there's a moment in the story where Si is perhaps starting to question a little bit what he's done, and Elsie, his dead wife, he's kind of thinking about her, and it's sort of a waking dream, I suppose, and she sort of says to him, you know, you did what? You know, you left our child and headed off for 2 years on a journey like that, and I suppose there's a wonderful story by Joanna Walsh, a short story writer, and it's about a contemporary story about a couple, and they're on a beach, and they take it in turns to watch the children, and it's all about how when the husband's watching the children, the wife is still watching the children.
Oh, yeah.
So there probably is an element of that in there.
Yeah, like you say, probably there could only be. Going from writing a novel after focusing on short stories for a couple of years, did your process change much? Because one of the things that the epic in miniature is in the copy, and it does feel like an epic in miniature. It's a really restrained novel. Did your writing process kind of adapt to writing a longer thing, or did you always feel like
it didn't feel very, very different. Obviously, I mean, I knew fairly early on that it couldn't be a short story. It was just that there were too many layers, there were too many different points of view. You know, short stories, like they're quite sort of, they're very unforgiving, quite brittle things that they collapse pretty quickly if you overburden them. So I think for this one, I think there were just too many big themes, too many characters. It had to be a longer work. What I did love, which was something completely new for me, was having chapters. I absolutely loved the chapter and what you could do with that. So it's as I said before, it's a story that alternates between the East and the West, between Si's story and Bess's story, and I love the resonances and the spaces that that began to establish themselves between the chapters, and also how each individual chapter has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which in a way is sort of like each one is like a little short story, and you want to leave it in exactly the right moment in the way that you would with a short story, and the space between the end of one chapter and the beginning of another chapter, and the symmetries, all that was tremendously exciting to play around with. I really enjoyed that.
As I said to you, it felt also it could have been a 700-page novel, but you achieved the emotional and narrative impact in, 130, 140 pages. Was the first draft around this length like that? It just seems like it would have been so hard to do. I don't think I could. It was never a great long epic that I cut down to this. I had a very clear idea of what I didn't want it to be. I didn't want it to be, white settler meets Native American boy, and then they go off and they have all these a series of escapades and adventures. I thought, I'm not going to give you that. That's not this book. In my mind's eye, I just see these two tiny figures, just sort of almost like on a map, just making their very slow way across the expanses. And actually, one of the things that really struck me when I read the Lewis and Clark diaries is just how boring and event-free most of that journey was. And I think I wanted to be a little bit true to that, it was only every few weeks that they had an encounter or something happened. The rest of it was just, this enormous expanse that they were just plodding across. And that was a really interesting thing to read as well, to remember that there was once a world that was just all blank space on a map, and that you could go out there and get completely
Absolutely. I mean, I never quite got over because essentially what happened in at the beginning of the 19th century was that the United States acquired this territory west of the Mississippi River from France. And just to give you some sense of it, it reached all the way down to parts of Texas, New Mexico, all the way up to parts of Canada. It's completely vast, and it was essentially pristine. Other than Lewis and Clark, nobody had made proper maps of it. It was terra incognita.
And that notion, this is a kind of very Irish question, but I don't know, I wonder if it's similar for a Welsh person. We have a kind of a weird graw or connection to the American West. Like we love, in parts of the country we love country and Western music. Mm-hmm. We all grew up reading Westerns. Mike McCormack says that he knew the lands of Arizona better than he knew the lands of his own county from reading all these books. Mm-hmm. Is there a draw towards the West in kind of the society?
I think there is definitely something for Europeans about. I mean, I first travelled into the West in the 90s, and I don't think anything can quite prepare a European for the scale and majesty of the Rockies or the emptiness of the deserts. We just don't have anything like that, and I think that stayed with me. I always wanted to write about that. I just didn't know what the story was.
And here it's come. Fantastic.
And the maps, when I was researching it, researching in the map archive at the New York Public Library, and just looking at map after map after map, where they just stopped, and there was just a few dotted lines, a few question marks, and they just really didn't know what was out there.
There's something. It actually, the more I read on, the more I believed there might. I was like, well, actually, he's dead right. Maybe there are giants out here.
Yeah.
Because it just is so it's off world.
Well, that's I mean, in this novel. Cy, he is the only one who believes it, other than Bess. Everybody, he's surrounded by naysayers. What Cy doesn't know is that a lot of his very learned contemporaries, including President Jefferson, including Benjamin Franklin, lots of top naturalists, they believed it. Jefferson desperately wanted there to be mammoths roaming around in the West because he was having a furious argument with the French, there was a Frenchman who published a best-selling book called The Theory of American Degeneracy, in which he posited that everything in the New World was small, that the deer had smaller antlers, the dogs had quieter barks. He even suggested that the genitalia of the men were shriveled and tiny. So it was sort of part of making America great, if you like, that these animals should exist.
And belief, we might finish on the idea of belief actually, because Cy is someone who went to church, believed in God. Mm-hmm. His wife died, and at the point we meet him, he now fully believes in this kind of wondrous thing. So in many ways I felt I was reading a novel about belief. Is that something you're aware of? Do you think that we all have a belief structure and it just something fills in if you lose belief in one thing?
I think Cy's curiosity and desire to find these animals, it is a kind of faith almost, because there's no real foundation for that he just clings to. And Bess similarly, her faith is in him, and without giving too much away, the end, there is a sort of moment of grace, a kind of something quite miraculous.
You'll never guess. I tried.
Which is, it's a sort of gift. It's a sort of gift from Cy to Bess. That's how I see the ending.
And it's a marvellous, and we talk about the element of kind of the way you can surprise your readers. I did think of every possible way this was going to happen, and I didn't get anywhere close. So it's a fantastic gift to end a book with. What's next? Is there something in the pipeline?
There are some stories and another novel at the moment. Sort of, it's a bit like spinning plates, and there are a few plates spinning.
Slow down.
Yeah, I just finished a new short story. And got my head stuck in the novel as well.
Fantastic. And for the immediate future, you're our Frank O'Connor Fellow.
Yes.
So you're going to be around Cork.
Till the end of November.
Till the end of November, you're going to be teaching, and if anyone sees her, please feel free to drag her into the pub for a pint and quiz her some more. Can we say thank you to Carys? She'll be signing books.